A special thanks to my Patreon supporters. Doctors and nurses of Reddit, what was the creepiest last words you heard from a patient right before they died? I had a cousin that had cancer and died when he was a little kid. He once asked her mother why all these people visited, and she said, "Because your cousins, aunts and uncles love you very much and want you to get better," and he answered, "I am not talking about them, I am talking about the ones that visit me at night." My mom was watching over my great-grandfather in the hospital. He'd been unresponsive for a day or so, when suddenly he said, "It's about damn time you got here. I've been waiting." And then he died. Not a doctor, but I overheard an old lady whisper this to her old husband dying of kidney problems. "You are going to beat this, you got away with murder, this is nothing." But I don't know how to get there. Grandpa in hospice. Hadn't spoken in days. Died about 2 hours later. I work in a cardiac ICU. We had a patient who had a pulmonary artery rupture, a rare, but known complication of a Swan-Ganz catheter. 1 minute he was joking around with us and the next bright red blood was spewing out of his mouth. His last words before he died were, "Why is this happening to me?" It still haunts me years later. Nurse here, had a patient come into the ER with shortness of breath. He started deteriorating in the ER, and then quite rapidly on the transport up the ICU. We got him wheeled into his room, replaced the ER lines and tubes with our own, and transferred him from the transport stretcher to his ICU bed. He actually did most of the transfer himself. He didn't say anything, but just before he died he pleasantly adjusted his own pillow, laid his head down, and then his eyes went blank. This man just made himself comfortable before laying down to die. I'm a nurse and was previously working at an assisted living community on the dementia/Alzheimer's unit. My very favorite patient had been declining pretty steadily, so I was checking on him very frequently. We would have long chats and joke around with each other, but in the last 2 weeks of his life, he stopped talking completely and didn't really acknowledge conversation directed at him at all. I finished my medication rounds for the evening and went to see him before I left. I told him I was leaving for the night and that I'd see him the following day, and he looked me in the eyes and smiled so genuinely and said, "You look like an angel." I thought it was so sweet because he had not seemed lucid in weeks. He died the next morning. It really messed with me. People seem to know. I'm in trauma. The most often times I have people ask if they're dying or say they're dying, they're either completely fine and being dramatic, or B. already have one foot in the ground. The B's are what get me. They know what's coming, somehow, and reach out for us and ask for salvation, not realizing it's not really ours to give. We can work hard, but sometimes their fate is out of our hands. Those people keep me up at night, and, if I fall asleep, show up in my dreams. I found one of my comfort measures only patient standing at the side of his bed. It surprised me because he had been mostly unresponsive during my shift. I helped him back into bed and he asked me why all these people were in his room. He suddenly became quiet again and I noticed he wasn't breathing. He was a DNR, so there wasn't anything to do to try to bring him back. Looking back, he may have been talking about me and the CNA that was helping me get him back into bed, but who knows what or who he was seeing the last minutes of his life. Still creeps me out a little when I think about it. All of my family members who have died with people nearby to watch them pass have talked about seeing people in the room with us. Usually they talk about long past family members. Honestly, I find it more comforting than anything else. My grandma was the most recent. She talked about seeing her two children that she outlived. One died when she was 7, the other was my uncle who died last year. Then her eyes lit up and she had a big smile and said to the air, "You've grown," and my uncle, not the dead one obviously, asked her who she was talking to. She gave him the name that he and his wife had picked for a child they had who was stillborn. My grandpa on the same side of the family was having conversations with his long-dead brothers, then smiled and his last words were, "I see Jesus." Personally, I am religious, so I like to think that things are actually happening that we can't see, but even if I'm wrong and it is just your brain shutting down, how comforting is it to think that as you pass you'll see, or could see, all the people you love coming to welcome you home, even if it is just a hallucination. I think it's the best you could have. Not a nurse, not a doctor, but I'm an apprentice funeral director. We went to a nursing home on a removal, and as we were walking down the hall, one of the patients got antsy and opened the door to his room and saw us walking with a stretcher. "I'll see you next week, boys." And guess who we had to pick up the next week? Checked in on a patient before the end of my shift and she was in good spirits, had been joking with me the whole time. Her condition was tenuous, new trach, but she had been positive throughout. I asked how she was doing and she replied by singing, "The old gray mare ain't what she used to be," and wished me a good night. I came in the next morning and she had coded and died overnight. Came into an early shift and was handed over a patient who'd been very anxious and had a panic attack overnight. He was anxious all morning but obviously all fine, ECG fine, and so I just asked someone to sit with him to keep an eye on him / reassure him for me. He gets worse, really panicky, heavy breathing, he's on his side in a fetal position. Doctors will be in 10 minutes, so I tell him I'll get them to him as soon as they come in, but ask if he'll lie on his back for me to help his breathing. He tells me he won't make it until they get here and that he won't face the other way. Obviously still all fine at this point, but he's more agitated, so again I suggest he move position for comfort, and that's when he says, "I won't make it until the doctors get here. If I turn to face the other way I'll die." He repeated this a few times to me. He arrested literally as the doctors walked in, and he died on the side he'd been refusing to turn to. I'm convinced he knew. I live in the Pacific NW, and there was a rupture of the Olympic pipeline in Bellingham in 1999. The petroleum flowed into Whatcom Creek. There were two little boys playing in the creek behind one of their houses with a barbecue lighter. They just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the petroleum flowing into the creek was set on fire by the lighter they were playing with. It became a conflagration. We could see the thick black smoke pouring into the air from 25 miles away. From what I remember, one of the older brothers and a couple of his friends ran out to the creek behind their house and brought the boys out of the water. The little guys were severely burnt but in shock and with adrenaline running didn't realize how hurt they were. I still cry when I think about it to this day when I read that the little guys thought that they had caused the explosion from playing in the creek with a lighter. Worse, and this actually haunts me, is one of the boys telling the rescuers that, "Oh, my mom is going to be so mad that I ruined my new clothes." These little guys died the next day of their burns. It was an unbearable account. I've commented this somewhere before, but it stayed with me. I'm an RN, and while I was a student I was caring for a lady who had end-stage renal failure, had a DNAR and was shutting down. We were having a little chat, while I was chatting away while helping her put on some lotion, when she stopped, looked over my shoulder and said, "Bill's here, love, I've got to go," and swiftly stopped breathing. Read her old notes, and Bill was her deceased husband. Not a doctor or nurse, but my grandfather was on hospice care at home, and for 2 days he told us that he had to go with the little red-haired girl. We didn't know what he was talking about. When he died, we cleaned him up and called the hospice nurse on duty, who came right over. I happened to be the one to answer the door, and there she stood, 5'2" or so, with gorgeous blue eyes and the most beautiful red hair you've ever seen. I couldn't even manage "hello," but my grandmother looked around me and said very cheerfully, "Please come in, he's been waiting for you." I actually have 3 that stick out in my mind. An 83-year-old woman that said, "My mom's here. Are we going?" She died a few minutes later. Another older lady said, "I think I'm going to die today." We took vitals, everything seemed fine. She was stable. She had a heart attack a couple hours later. Not her last words, but the last she ever said to me. The last one is definitely the creepiest. A nice old lady who told my CNA she wanted to wear all white. When asked why, she said, "The man in black is here." She looked in the corner of the room. The CNA looked, but there was no one there. That's when I came into the room. We asked her to describe what she was seeing, and she said, "He's in all black, and he's got a top hat on." Then she whispered, "And his eyes are red," while her eyes moved across the room to directly behind the CNA, like she was watching him move closer to us. She died later that night. But it was unexpected. That room creeped me out for a long time after that. Grandfather died this year at 86. He was in Nashville in a hospital for pneumonia. I was working and was going to go down there the next day to see him. My mother called me and said he was passing soon and if I wanted to talk to him. I said yes, and this was the conversation verbatim. Me: "Hey Papa, it's Marky. How's it going?" "Grandfather, I'm sick." Me: "Can you hang on for a few more hours and I'll be there?" Grandfather: "Nope, I'm outta here." Me: "I love you." Grandfather: "Alright." He died before the phone hung up. Really bothered me with how accepting he was of his own death. I think about it every day. Surgeon here. Not sure if this is creepy, but a man on his deathbed kept repeating, "The body is in the woods next to the oak tree," over and over until he passed. The police were notified and they did search some woods behind the man's house, but never found anything. Working as a secretary in ICU nearly 20 years ago, there was a mid-30s patient who was full-blown AIDS, and was in ICU as a DNR, sort of contradictory, but there you go. Anyway, I can't remember if it was pneumonia or something else that landed him in ICU, but I do remember when things started falling apart. Instead of coding him, the nurses were coming in with drugs to relax him and make him comfortable. Out of nowhere, he changed his mind about the DNR, and started screaming, "I don't want to die yet. Please do something." So they called the code, but in the end, he didn't make it. The devil has been in my room all night, but don't worry, God is with you. This man had like the worst death ever too. He had a horrendous seizure and died with his eyes wide open and had a horrible grimace on his face. He had also been yelling all night about the devil and saying over and over, "Get out of here. This building's gonna blow." I worked in a secured Alzheimer's unit, and one of my 99-year-old residents rolled up to me in her wheelchair and said, "Can I use your phone, honey? I want to call my son before I die today." I said, "No, Granny," what everyone called her, "you aren't going to die today." I let her use my phone anyways. After dinner, one of the CNAs asked if I had seen her so they could put her in bed. I said no and helped them look for her. Turns out she just laid down in an unoccupied room and died that evening. I was never more happy that I had let a resident use my phone to call a family member. My grandpa told us that when we left his hospice room for the night that his brother-in-law/best friend and other male relatives came to visit him. He told us that they were coming to get him, but he kept telling them, "Not yet," and they'd be annoyed and give him one more day. He got away with 2 to 3 days because those relatives were pushovers. Somewhat happier story, during the daytime my mom and I went to visit my grandpa and he was awake but not 100% there. He kept pointing out into the hallway and asking my mom, "Are they over there?" and she was so confused. He looked at me, winked, and then used his pillow to pretend to be fishing, his favorite hobby, off the side of the bed I was sitting on. He looked at me and said, "Nope, not over here," then went to my mom's side and did the same thing. When he pointed, my mom looked out the door to see what the heck he was going on about and asked again what he was looking for. When she turned back to him, he hit her in the face with the pillow and laughed a huge genuine laugh and said, "Live bait." He was still very much himself to the very end, even if we didn't realize it originally. He told me as we were leaving that he was trying to cheer my mom up, and it worked.